Okay, guys, welcome to our next section of morphology where we are now going to combine the two concepts we've just reviewed. So we reviewed parts of speech earlier, and now we reviewed morphemes. So now we're going to look at how those two things come together. So key concepts we've already looked at: morphology in general. That term means word construction, right? So we've been looking at this whole time how words are made. We covered the term derivation. And so we can create, one way that we create new words is through derivation, which is basically adding affixation. So an affix can be a prefix like undo, or a suffix like doable. So we can add those things to words to create new words. We also covered the concept zero affixation, which was when you don't change anything about the word, you just create a new definition for it, right? So we looked at that in class. We looked at the word dam, right? So think about the word dam. The original meaning of that word probably had to do with boarding up water, right? Like a dam in a river, or beavers make dams, right? But we've changed that word with zero affixation over time, meaning we didn't add a prefix or suffix, but we just changed the meaning of it. So now dam can mean a curse word, essentially. So we've looked at the word morpheme, which means smallest unit of meaning. So we've been looking at these small units of meanings within words. And some of those small units of meaning are these affixes, are these prefixes or suffixes, or sometimes infixes. But as I said, those don't happen often. During your exercise for parts of speech, you've been working with these words, and we've answered a couple of these questions so far. And we're going to answer one more in this presentation. So in order to go into this presentation again, we're looking at parts of speech. Nouns, adjectives, verbs, and adverbs. You learned those a couple lectures ago. Just to recap, a noun is basically a word used to reference a person, place, or thing. So that could be woman, man, or wedding. I want to clarify right here that yes, wedding can also be used as a verb, right? She is wedding him. But we don't typically do that. We typically mean wedding as an event or a thing, right? So in that way, it can be used as the noun. An adjective is something that describes something about the noun. So a handsome man, a gorgeous woman, a quiet wedding. A verb is the action in the sentence. What is the noun or the object doing? Well, the woman was quieting. The man jumped. Those are the actions they're performing. And then an adverb, which is typically one of the more complicated concepts of these four parts of speech, is something that can tell us about anything in the sentence, tell us something about any of the words in the sentence, but it doesn't describe a noun or a pronoun. So adverbs can really kind of exist anywhere. They just don't ever describe nouns or pronouns. They describe verbs. So the woman was sweetly quieting the man down. It's the word sweetly is describing the verb quieting. The man was very handsome. This can describe an adjective. Very is describing the word handsome. It is not describing the noun man. Otherwise, the sentence would say the very man, right? And that in this context doesn't make sense for us. And it can modify other things, like yesterday I went to a wedding. So in that case, it's modifying, or it's describing the time that the verb happened, right? Or that the sentence happened. So anyways, those are our four parts of speech. So we're going to use those to kind of guide our discussion today. And we're basically going to look at the connection between parts of speech and affixation. And we're basically answering the question, what is the job of affixation? What happens when we add these units, these small morphemes, these prefixes and suffixes? What happens to the words when they're being attached? And by doing this, we're going to also address the one question I've been proposing in the last couple lectures. Why can agreement, this is one of the words in our exercise, our taco story exercise, why can agreement be a noun when agree is a verb? So let's dive into this question and talk about this concept that we're addressing, where parts of speech meets morphemes, meets prefixes and suffixes. And let's start by looking at the morpheme S. And we're specifically looking at the plural S. Okay, so plural as in cats, dogs, pencils, desks. And then we have some other words where we've added the S to, but they're not accurate. So pores, quicklies, reds, tails, sorry, talls. Pours has an S, and some of you are already thinking, well, wait, the S works on the word pours, right? He pours himself a glass of milk. However, we're talking about the morpheme S, meaning plural. Can you have plural? Can you mean pours as in pouring multiple times? And the answer is no. So the S on pours means something different, and we're going to get to that later. We're talking about the S meaning plural. So cats, dogs, pencils, and desks. So we want to ask ourselves the questions, what conclusions can we draw about the plural morpheme S? What rules can we observe based on these example words? What definition of S, the morpheme S, might we have in our lexicon? So let's check it out. The morpheme S, we've looked at example words like this, and we looked at cats. So cat is the free morpheme and S is the bound morpheme. And our first question was, what conclusion can we draw about the plural morpheme S? Well, it can only ever attach to nouns and not to verbs, adjectives, or adverbs. Because just as in our previous example, we saw the word pours. Pours ended in S, right? It ended in the same morpheme. But in that instance, the S did not mean plural. Okay, so what definition of S might we have in our lexicon? Well, one of the definitions is going to be that it means plural. That when the S is attached to certain types of words, it means more than one. It by itself, the S doesn't mean anything, but when it's attached to certain types of words, it does have meaning. And specifically, when it's attached to nouns, it has the meaning of being plural, to mean more than one. So again, looking at our examples here on the screen, cats, dogs, pencils, and desks. Cat, dog, pencil, desk, those are all nouns. And when you add the plural S morpheme to it, it means plural. Where when we add the S to writes, it doesn't mean plural writing, multiple writings, right? Quicklies, handsome, speaks. Those words, write is a verb, quickly is an adverb, handsome is an adjective, and speak is a verb. And you'll notice how the S does not, in the meaning plural, meaning more than one, does not work on those words. So this leads us to the question, and this is also to prepare you for upcoming quizzes. Does adding the suffix S change the word's parts of speech? So looking at cat, and then we add the cats, this suffix to it. Does it change the word's parts of speech? So cat, I already told you, was a noun, right? So when I make it plural with the S, does it change to something else? Well, the answer is no. It was a noun, and it is still a noun. Cat is a noun, and cats is a noun. Let's look at another example. The morpheme re. Think about the following words: reuse, refresh, reboil, re-energize. Then we have words that it doesn't work with: re-sad, re-puppy, re-quickly, re-desk. So what conclusions can we draw about the morpheme re given these example words? What definition of re might we have in our lexicon, in our mental dictionary? So we'll use the example reuse. Our free morpheme there is use, and our bound morpheme is re. So what conclusions can we draw about re? Well, it can only attach to verbs, not to nouns, adverbs, or adjectives. And what definition might we have for re in our head? It means to do something again, to make something happen, right? So to reuse means to use something again. So we do have a definition for it in our head, even though it's not on its own a full word. Okay, even though the morpheme re is not a full word, it does have meaning. It is a morpheme. So the morpheme re, as I just said, can only attach to verbs. Think about the words on the left: use, fresh, boil, energize. Okay, so reuse, reboil, re-energize, refresh. However, the words on the right: re-sad, sad is an adjective, re-puppy, puppy is a noun, quickly is an adverb, and desk is a noun. Some of you are thinking, well, fresh might be an adjective, right? He was fresh. But we can also use fresh as a verb, right? So I was freshening the sheets, right? And so there, in that case, it's a verb. So this begs the question, does adding the prefix re change the word's parts of speech? So we know use is a verb, right? But when we add re to it to create reuse, does that change it to something else, like a noun, adjective, or adverb? And the answer is no. It was a verb and is still a verb. So use is a verb and reuse is still a verb. Let's look at this one, the morpheme able. Think about the following words: usable, breakable, adjustable, debatable. And then we have the words on the right: pinceable, greenable, feeable, or featable, and quicklyable. So based on this word bank, what conclusions can we draw about the morpheme able? What definition of able might we have in our mental dictionary? Well, let's look at the word usable, right? So in usable, the free morpheme is use. We just used this free morpheme in our last example, and able is the bound morpheme it has to attach. To usable, to use. So what conclusions can we draw about the morpheme able? Well, it can only ever attach to verbs, not to nouns, adjectives, or adverbs. And what definition of able might we have in our heads? Well, it means to have the ability to do something. So danceable means a song that you have the ability to dance to. Maybe it sounds good, so it's danceable, right? But when I say it can only attach to verbs, let's look at our word bank again. Usable, breakable, adjustable, debatable. Use, break, adjust, debate. Those are all words that can function as verbs. And then we have our word bank on the right. Pinceable, pencil is a noun. Green is an adjective. Feet is a noun. Quickly is an adverb. And you can see how able cannot attach to those words. So this begs the question, does adding the suffix able change the word's parts of speech? And the answer here is yes. I know in our last examples it didn't change the parts of speech, but it does here. So think about use. The word use is a verb. But when I add able to it, it is no longer a verb. So the answer here is yes, it was a verb when it was just the word use, but it is now an adjective. Usable is an adjective to describe that something is capable of being something. Let's think of an example. The pencil was usable. Was is the verb there, but usable describes something about the noun. It describes something about pencil. The definition of an adjective is it describes something about the noun. And when I say the pencil was usable, I'm describing that the pencil was usable. So let's revisit this question that I've proposed over the last couple lectures. Why can agreement be a noun when agree is a verb? We can address this question basically how we've used our last couple examples. So let's talk about the morpheme ment. Think about the following words: agreement, entertainment, embarrassment, treatment. And then we have our nonsense words: pencilment, greenment, feetment, quicklyment. So what conclusions can we draw about the morpheme ment in our head, and what definition do we have for ment in our head? So let's look at the word agreement, right? So our free morpheme is agree. And our bound morpheme, the one that has to attach, is ment. And what conclusions can we draw about this morpheme? Well, it can only attach to verbs, not to nouns, adjectives, or adverbs. Okay, agree. I agree with you. Agree is a verb. So what definition of ment might we have in our mental dictionary, in our lexicon? Well, it basically means an action or resulting state. Okay? So it's describing an action or a resulting state. Agreement, therefore, means a negotiation or a course of action result in a resulting state of harmony and opinion. Okay? So this is why it's a noun. It's the resulting state of something. So the morpheme ment, I just told you, it can only attach to verbs. Think about those words on the left. Agree, entertain, embarrass, treat. Those are verbs. Where on the right, we can't have pencilment because ment can't attach to a noun. It can't attach to the adjective green or the noun feet or the adverb quickly. It can only attach to verbs. So that begs the question, does adding the suffix ment change the word's parts of speech? And the answer is yes. It was a verb. Agree is a verb, but now it is a noun. Agreement is a noun. Some of you are thinking this, especially when I gave one of my earlier examples. What's the difference between compounding or affixation, right? And so I'll use this word to illustrate that. What about able? Why isn't huggable a compound word, right? Because we all know able is a word. It's an adjective, it's in the dictionary. I am able to go. I can use it as a free morpheme. So why am I saying that it's a bound morpheme when it's attached to these other words and it's not compounding? So if you remember, compounding is when you take two full words in English and put them together, like tree house or high chair. So why isn't hug a bull a compound word? Well, able and able are considered different words, different morphemes, okay? Even though they sound the same, they serve different functions. We have lots of words in English that sound the same or are spelt the same. So those homophones, homonyms, homographs, we have a lot of words that do this. But able and able are just like that. They have different functions. The word able is a free morpheme and can operate as an adjective. I am able to go. The suffix able or ible is completely different. We can use those to create an adjective. So think about the verb do. He will do that. But I can add able to it and make it an adjective, right? So the project is doable. So the suffix able and ible serve a function is that they can turn verbs into adjectives, and we just saw that example. The thing we're looking at here is that able and ible are the same suffix, okay? They're just spelt different based on English conventions. We don't need to English spelling conventions. So look at the word I am responsible. The free morpheme there is response, okay? And we can attach able to it to make it an adjective. Response is a verb. Okay, that's how it's primarily used. We can see this illustration with the suffix full. So in English, we have the word, the free morpheme full. It's an adjective. I have a full stomach. And then we also have the suffix full. And you can see this one's a little easier to conceptualize because it's spelt differently, right? And the suffix full is not a free morpheme. It's bound. It has to add to something. So he is doubtful tonight. Okay, so doubt is a verb and full makes it an adjective. So again, this changes our verbs to adjectives. The main point I want to illustrate as I wrap up this little lecture here is that in your head, your mental dictionary, we've used the word lexicon quite a bit. In your mental dictionary, you know all this stuff. You are successfully able to navigate between all the nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs that you have in your head with all these morphemes, all these suffixes and infixes that you have in your head. You have millions and millions of morphemes and morphemes in your head, and those morphemes are made up of suffixes, infixes, prefixes, and all these free morphemes like blue, clean, drive, cat, dog, and your brain is like this computer that can put these things together, and it is following rules when it does it. So some of the examples I showed you, those are rules you're obeying in English, you just weren't aware of them. And there's a reason why words that end in ible or able are always in the adjective position when you use them, because you know these English rules. What we just discovered was what you're actually doing and what rule it is you're obeying. So with that in mind, you'll move into your next exercise entitled Exercise Morphemes and Parts of Speech. And based on our word bank here that we've been working with the last couple exercises, you're going to tell me, much like in our examples, when we add the prefix or suffix to the word, does that change the part of speech? And so in order to answer some of these when you go into the exercise, you might need to use the dictionary. You need to think about how that word is used in our exercise, right? So how is it used in the sentence? You need to be able to identify the free morpheme and bound morpheme, right? So let's look at the word agreement again. Let's say I asked you the question, does adding the suffix ment to agree, creating the word agreement, change the part of speech? Well, in order for you to be able to answer that question, you need to do a couple things. First, I would look at that word and go, okay, well, what's my free morpheme and what are my bound morphemes? Okay, so in agreement, I know agree is the free morpheme. It can operate by itself. It's a freestanding word. and ment is a bound morpheme. Okay, so what part of speech is agree? And this might be where you need to go consult a dictionary. And you did an exercise a little earlier with these words where you might have had to use a dictionary then as well. But you could go to the dictionary and find that agree in this case, in the case of our story, is used as a verb, right? And then again, so what does ment do it? Due to that word. If agree is a verb, is agreement a verb or is it something else? Well, I told you earlier, agreement is an adjective, right? Or a noun, pardon me. Agreement is a noun. But in order to answer some of these questions, you might need to use a dictionary, and that's okay. Right now, we're just building awareness of the fact that morphemes, all these free morphemes and bound morphemes, when they combine together, they have a significant impact on the way you can use these words in speech. So go ahead and try this exercise. Give it a go. Like I said, use a dictionary if you need to, and then proceed on to the next lecture when you are ready. Bye.